Hello, namaste, satnam, everyone. Hope you're doing well today. I wanted to welcome you all to this sample chart reading in terms of the Jyotish and the Vedic astrological system of chart analysis and interpretation. Whether you are familiar with Jyotish or not, or familiar with Western astrology or not, this short video is really just meant to give a foundational overview of what we look at in the Vedic system when we interpret a birth chart specifically. So what I'll do is I'm going to pull up my shared screen in a second here, and I'm going to use a sample chart that we'll be using for kind of demonstration purposes. We'll talk through a few of the key factors, and then we'll go from there. So here we go. All right. So this is a snapshot of a birth chart, meaning it's calculated using someone's specific birth information. Very important that the birth information is as accurate as possible. That has a huge effect on the process. What's needed is the month, day, and year of birth, as well as the location, city, state, city, country. And then what's very critical in the Vedic system is that the birth time is as accurate as possible. A lot of times, birth times on birth certificates are not exactly exact. There's a lot of things happening when a baby is born. So oftentimes, what we'll do is we'll use the birth information, but then looking at your life, looking at events that have happened, relationships, tendencies, it may verify that birth information is being accurate, or we may shift it around slightly. So very common. If you don't know your birth information, it is very difficult to do an accurate Vedic reading. If you have an approximate birth information, again, we can use that. But if you have no idea, it can be done, but it's really not ideal. So again, this is a birth chart. So this is a snapshot of the constellations in the sky and the planets at the time that this individual was born. A lot of times what we do in Vedic astrology is for a first reading, and even for subsequent readings, we use the birth chart really as the main focal point. But what we then also look at, which is very important, is where the planets are in the present day, because there's a direct relationship between the present day positioning of the planets and the location of the planets and signs at the time of birth. So for the purposes of this, we're going to focus solely on the birth chart, but that is something for awareness that we bring into the readings as well. So in terms of the Vedic system, this is what a sample chart looks like, and this is what we call the South Indian style. There's another style known as the North Indian, which looks a little bit different. I personally prefer the South Indian, but if you do like North Indian or you want to know more about that, certainly something that we can discuss. But the South Indian style, you can see it has these 12 boxes, and each of these boxes represents one of the signs of the zodiac. So, for instance, Aries is typically the kind of starting sign of the zodiac. Then we have Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. And you can see the little abbreviations in the corners of the boxes that represents each of the names of the specific signs. Then you see these letters in the boxes themselves, and these letters are representative of the position of the planets at the time of birth. So in the Vedic system, we only use the naked eye planets. We don't use the further orbiting planets, Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, as these can't be observed without a telescope. And Vedic astrology was being done 5,000 years ago when they did not have telescopes. So it was all naked eye astronomy. So we use the primary luminaries, the sun and the moon, and then the main naked eye planets of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Those are the primary planetary luminary energies that we look at. You can see each of those represented here. SU is Sun, MO is Moon, ME is Mercury, VE is Venus, MA is Mars, JU is Jupiter, and SA is Saturn. In addition, there's a couple of other key energies that we look at in the Vedic system, which are known as Rahu and Ketu. These are not used in the Western system, but they're very important from a more subtle energetic perspective in Vedic astrology and really looking at karmic implications specifically. So Rahu and Ketu are not actually planets or things in the sky that you would see. They're actually points along the ecliptic of the sun and the moon where there is the possibility for a solar or a lunar eclipse. Anytime there is a solar or a lunar eclipse, it has to do with the sun and the moon being on a point of either Rahu or Ketu. So, very important. There's a lot more to that. If you'd like to look at some of the supplementary videos and articles on Rahu and Ketu, I'm not going to get into those in too much detail here. A couple other just quick things with these planets. You do see, for instance, in this chart that there is a capital R after several of the planets. So, for instance, Saturn has a capital R, Mercury has a capital R, and Venus has a capital R. Different computing systems will symbolize retrograde motion differently. This one uses an R. Sometimes you'll see the planets underlined. But whether it's underlined or whether it's an R, it means that these particular planets at this individual's birth time were moving in retrograde motion, meaning that to the eye, it seemed as if they were moving backward in their orbit. That does have some important implications in terms of a chart and the respective energies of the planet. I'm not going to get into that again in too much detail here, but sometimes you'll see that in a chart, sometimes you won't, sometimes it may be with just, a planet or multiple planets. So that depends. So this is kind of the basic outline. And in the Vedic system, what's so important more than anything is we actually look at what is called the rising sign. So in Western astrology, if you're familiar with it, also in Eastern, the sort of three main components is someone's sun sign, moon sign, and rising sign. In the Western system, a lot of times the sun sign gets more attention. The moon obviously has an importance as well, as does the rising. But typically, when we're asking someone, hey, what's your sign? Or we're talking about the sign season of the calendar year, it's usually referring to the position of the sun. But in the Vedic system, we actually use the rising sign as the primary focal entryway into the energetics of someone's chart. Everything is really based around that rising sign position. The moon and the sun definitely have an importance and are looked at specifically, but the rising sign sets the tone. And that's why it's so important that the birth time be accurate, because the rising sign changes every 2 hours. And so if the birth time is off, to an extent that it changes the rising sign from being what it actually should be, you're going to have a totally different chart interpretation. Okay. So in a rising sign is also called an ascendant, because when you were born, that is the constellation that was rising or ascending on the eastern horizon as the Earth was rotating. So it was the one that was coming up over the horizon. Now, in this individual's chart, I'm just going to point out the rising sign. They happen to be an ascendant of Libra. So the constellation of Libra was rising when this individual was born. And you can see that by these little parallel lines here. Sometimes, again, in certain charts, you may see the letters A, S, C, which is ascendant, and that also symbolizes the rising sign. Okay, so what we do based on the rising sign is you then have what are known as houses. So these are what these numbers refer to: 1, 2, 3, all the way through 12. There's one house per sign of the zodiac. And so the rising sign sets the house as number 1. The first house is always equivalent with the rising sign. So for this individual, their rising sign and their first house would be Libra. Their second house would be Scorpio. third house, Sagittarius, fourth house, Capricorn, and so on. And each of these houses have specific meanings for your domain of life. For instance, the fourth house has to do with the mother, it has to do with the home, it has to do with property, it has to do with emotions. The seventh house, for instance, has to do with relationships, especially the intimate partnership and marriage. The eighth house has to do with death, with tantra, yoga, these more occult, kind of deeper, mysterious aspects of life. The ninth house has to do with dharma, with wisdom, with education, higher knowledge, the guru, and so on. So each house kind of represents a domain of your life. And this is very important because we can kind of get a sense for how that domain of your life is going to be energetically, depending upon the sign that it's associated with, as well as the planets that are in it or that influence it. Okay. So that is what we would consider the 12 houses connected to each of the signs of the zodiac. Now, lastly, the biggest thing that we look at are the planets, of course, because each planet has a very particular energy that it's associated to. And these energies are going to then influence those areas of life in particular ways. So, for instance, I'll just pick one or two. Jupiter is a very, very, very what they consider a benefic planet, typically. It is one of the highest planets of wisdom, of dharma, of prosperity. It's the significator of so much grace in our life. It also has the qualities of water and earth and devotion and these different energetics that are connected to it. The planet of Saturn, for instance, tends to be considered a malefic, meaning it can be a very challenging planet to a certain extent, where Jupiter is very expansive. It tends to expand the areas it's connected with. Saturn tends to contract the areas it's connected with. It tends to limit or to obstruct or to block. It's not a negative thing. There's a lot of times where Saturn's energy can be the greatest thing we need and it can give us incredible wisdom, but it's going to feel very different than Jupiter's energy. Saturn, too, has more of an airy element to it. It's much more of, in Ayurveda, we would call Vata dosha, whereas Jupiter is more Kapha dosha. And yeah, Saturn has just a little bit of a slower type of an energy to it. So again, we look at these energies and how they play out in our lives and which ones tend to be dominant in our overall makeup, as well as dominant in the present moment. So we get into these planetary energies, we get into the houses in the reading. And again, we really look at the rising sign because that tells so much about your character, about your gifts, about your challenges, and kind of sets the tone. So that's a pretty good basic overview of just the Jyotish chart orientation. A few other things just to point out that are very important, and that's also different than Western astrology, is over here on the right-hand side. These are what we call dasha periods. And dashas are periods of time in your life. In the Vedic system, we look at these across a 120-year calendar cycle. Each dasha has a particular number of years, as short as 6 years, up to 20 years, and everything in between. And these are set based on your birth information. So when you're born into a particular planetary period, and then the calendar begins from there and unfolds through your life. And this is very important because these planetary periods, again, will sort of cast, you know, a shadow, or they'll cast an energy over the period of life that they govern. And they'll bring their particular energies as it pertains to you, as it pertains to their position in your chart, the houses in your chart, and the kind of overall influence that they have. So these are fascinating. And I think gives a very, very, very cool approach to, again, understanding really the seasons of your life, because there's a time for everything, and each season is going to have its particular challenges, it's going to have its particular blessings. And the more you understand that, and with this whole system, the more you align with the natural rhythm and understand the energies at play in your life, the more you can thrive, the more you can help to mitigate some of the difficulties or be aware of the possibilities for um, expansion, the possibilities for contraction, and have a more conscious relationship with yourself and with life. And that's what this whole thing is about. Ultimately, Jyotish, Ayurveda, yoga, they're all about expanding our consciousness. They're all about helping us to achieve greater levels of awareness so that we can live more consciously in our lives. We can really embody the dharma that we're here to do in this lifetime, because everybody's chart is very unique. We're all a unique expression of consciousness with our particular neuroses and karmic tendencies and destructive patterns and all of our unique blessings and gifts and skills. And so the more we understand that, again, the more we can be in alignment with that in our life. So just to show you, this individual in their chart was born in a what we call sun Mahadasha, and then they shortly thereafter went into their moon Mahadasha, then their Mars Mahadasha, and then they currently are in their Rahu Mahadasha, since right now it is 2022. So they're in the middle of this Rahu period, and then after that, they will be moving into their Jupiter period, then Saturn, Mercury, and so on. So that's something we always spend a lot of time looking at in the Vedic system to understand the timing of things. And that's what we can use a lot of the times. You don't have your birth information. We can kind of look at life events and timeline them out and typically line them up energetically with certain periods or certain planetary transits. The last thing I'll just mention, kind of while we have the chart open, is that if you want, one of the things that is so important to Vedic astrology and Ayurvedic astrology, the more medical and kind of lifestyle approach, is that this whole thing is not just information. Yes, of course, we want to understand what's happening. We do need to know the information to have that expanded awareness. However, what's so important in Jyotish and in Ayurveda is, what do we do with that information? Now that we know the energies at play, we know the tendencies that we have for good and bad, what do we do about it? And that's where at the end of your reading, always, we want to have a very practical plan of action for lifestyle recommendations, for potentially foods to incorporate that will support you, herbs to take, aromas to use, colors to use, sounds to use, certain yoga practices, certain meditation mantras, certain devotional practices. There's so many different ways that you can actually incorporate these more subtle energetics in your life in a practical and concrete way. And that's really what it comes down to, because this whole system of Jyotish and understanding the subtle energies is a system of karma. And karma means action. And so we want to take actions that are going to be conducive to our well being. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this was beneficial. Again, for those of you that have more of a background with Western astrology, very typically, if you know your Western chart, you can pretty much calculate your Jyotish chart by just subtracting 24 signs from every position of your Western chart, because the Jyotish chart is a little bit earlier in its positioning. And if you want to know more about that, you can visit the FAQs and understand the calculations behind each of those systems. But this is, again, kind of a system that's been around for 5,000 years. It has stood the test of time. The other forms of astrology, Western and otherwise, really, branched off of the Vedic tradition, which originated kind of this system of observation of the heavens and the subtle energies. But it's a wonderful technology. It's a wonderful science. And at the end of the day, I always say it's really, how's it working, in your life? How does it actually stand the test of time? How does it carry into your activities? Because that's really what's most important at the end of the day, rather than just information and knowledge, is how are we using that to grow and to evolve. So if you have any more questions, if you have not done a reading and you would like to do one, or if you have some things you'd like to discuss prior to booking a reading, we can arrange for a short consultation call. We'll be happy to do that. Or if you would like to schedule a call and book a session, you can do so via the scheduling page. And I look forward to supporting you on your journey with Jyotish and Ayurveda and yoga any way that I'm able. Satnam.